Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Effective Supports to Lead to Success on the Job Toward Recovery and Empowerment. My name is Kathy Shepard-Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. And on behalf of the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I am delighted to introduce our presenters, Katie Wolf-Whaley and Paul Weyman. Katie Wolf-Whaley is the director of the Kentucky Supported Employment Training Project. She currently chairs Kentucky's Employment First Council, sits on the national board of APSE, which is the Association of People Supporting Employment First. And Katie serves as the president of the Kentucky chapter of APSE as well. Her history in supported employment is long, deep, and meaningful. Joining Katie today is Dr. Paul Weyman, professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in the School of Education's Counseling and Special Education. He is the director of the VCU Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment with other funded, what are known as RRTCs, and also serves as the director for the VCU Autism Center for Excellence and the Center for Transition Innovations. Dr. Weyman has received national honors and recognition of his leadership, research, scholarly efforts, and mentorship, with strong emphasis on transition from school to work. We are so fortunate to have Katie and Paul leading this webinar. But before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details to share. First and foremost, please be sure to visit our social media and website, which is mhddcenter.org, for resources related to mental health and developmental disabilities. If you are joining us using the full features of Zoom, the controls are located at the bottom bar of your Zoom window. Please use the chat box if you have any comments or technical issues, and we will do our best to assist you. Please use the Q&A to submit questions for our presenters. We will read your questions as time allows throughout the presentation or during the optional Q&A time from 3 to 3:30. This is a bonus for our attendees today, and thank you so much to Katie and Paul for doing this as well. All right, there is also a hand-raising feature that you can use if you need assistance from the MHDD team throughout the webinar. Other than those who are presenting the webinar today, everyone is muted and camera access is turned off. The webinar is being live captioned. You can turn on the captions in the Zoom window by clicking the CC button on the menu and selecting Show Subtitles. You can also change the size of the caption text by selecting Subtitle Settings. ASL interpreting services are being provided by Central Kentucky Interpreter Referral. The webinar is also being broadcast live on YouTube. So if you are joining us on YouTube, please add your questions and comments to the live chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MHDD YouTube channel and the MHDD website later this week. That's really fast. We will be sending out an email following the webinar with an evaluation, and please, please, please go ahead and complete that evaluation so that we can improve future webinars. The email that you get will also include instructions on how to receive continuing education credits. So once again, thank you so much for being here, and I am now delighted to turn it over to Katie.
Thank you. All right, we sharing okay? Okay. All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me today and for everyone who is joining from wherever all you're coming, whether live or watching this recorded. If we were, though this is a webinar series, but if we were in person and actually got to meet you somewhere at dinner, through friends, on the sidelines of a kid's soccer game or a PTA meeting or something of the like, we would probably exchange pleasantries, right? What's your name? And then the next question is always, what do you do? Right? And why? Because in our society, adults are generally expected to go to work. It's what we do. It's a huge part of our identity. When kids are young, they get asked, what do you want to be? Because it matters. It matters as who we are as a society that this is so very typical. But for one segment of society, too often it hasn't been the typical expectation. In fact, as you likely already know, people with disabilities have much lower rates of employment than people without disabilities. So if you look at any number of statistical sets, you'll see this, that we've hovered around that 30% employment rate of people with disabilities who are employed for decades. What is especially worth noting in this particular American Community Survey here is that 62% of people not in the labor market that aren't even looking for work, right? And there are lots of different sources that you can find this, where this has been historically the number. And in this particular set, you can see the variation also breaking it down, disability and employment by race, and how the greater variation of employment rates between races among people with disability than those without. The Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy also publishes these rates monthly. While it's been a difficult year, to be sure, you continue to see the trend of both labor force participation rate and the employment rate of people without disabilities more than double that of people with disabilities. And you see the unemployment rate of people without disabilities less than half of that rate for those with disabilities. So this is from the National Core Indicators data set. This is data that looks at looking at those people who receive intellectual developmental disability services from across the country. And this is showing us the co-occurring rate of those who also experience a mental health diagnosis. So you can get those numbers. And then when we look further at this NCI data, we see that the rate of employment is much lower for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities at just 18%. Remember, otherwise for overall people with disabilities, it's been hovering around 30. And then when we break it down and look at those surveys who have intellectual developmental disability and also have a mental illness, it's just 16%. And if you can see the rather small, I apologize, font, the descriptor on this, in this data, their definition of work is including more day activities than just competitive integrated employment, which is what we're going to talk about this afternoon and further in the second half. So we're going to spend a moment right now thinking about the why of this and these low rates. And then the second part of this is going to dig into the how to make it different. So there are lots of reasons that this is the case, right? So here are a few of those reasons, and I'm sure all of you on here can think of others, including people who may not understand what work is and so have unknowingly opted out of seeking employment. But oftentimes we find that people don't have the chance to opt in to looking for a job. There's low expectations, right? Often from a focus on deficits over time or being seen as not following routine or structure of school, or others just can't envision someone working, right? They can't even see this as a possibility. Sometimes it's seen as those difficult behaviors, right? And so there's the assumption that of course you couldn't work until those things stop, or we can't figure out transportation, or the system is overwhelming. And right now things are steady at the day program and we just can't fit it in the service plan. And then there's the whole issue of that fear of, for people who receive public benefits such as SSDI, SSI, or Medicaid, and that fear that if someone goes to work, then they're going to lose all of that. When we're working with people who experience significant and multiple disabilities, these issues get even bigger. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed by all of the services that are available and provided that all those services someone needs, that we don't even begin to think about looking for a job on top of all of that. And then sometimes when options are presented or even attempted, get limited to those entry-level service jobs, sometimes this can serve to screen people out. One of the things that these entry-level service jobs tend to have in common is that there's a higher rate of turnover. So if you're supporting someone who might take longer to learn a new task, or it might take coworkers a little bit longer to get to know that person or understand how she communicates, then that high turnover makes it really difficult because coworkers aren't around long enough to be able to provide instruction in ways that make sense for the person with a disability, or you never really become known by your coworkers. And then when these jobs fall through, it's too easy to think, well, if they couldn't hack it here, then they get that label of unemployable, right? We tried it, it didn't work. And if you can't compete for one of those jobs and keep it, then oftentimes people get left with nothing. And so we need to make sure that these aren't the only options. And because of these historically low expectations, because of the historically low employment rates for people with disabilities, because our system has so many other services to fill people's days other than supporting them to find a good job, employment first has gained in popularity. It started as a belief, it moved into policy, regulation, and now legislation. So in general, a definition for employment first means that employment in the general workforce should be the first and preferred option for individuals with disabilities receiving assistance from publicly funded systems. Simply put, employment first means real jobs for real wages. So on this map, you can see what states have formal orders and or legislation. This is on APSE's webpage. If you go to apse.org, there's a link in the slides that are available for you, or if you just Google APSE and employment first, you can pull this live map up and then you can click on your state or neighboring states and find out what's going on there in regards to employment first initiatives. I've also included APSE's statement on employment first and another plain language employment first statement version that was adapted by a self-advocate group in your resources for today. And while these efforts are making strides, they don't mandate that someone get a job, right? It's employment first, it's not employment only. So those of you who took the time to be here, who care about people and these issues, we need to understand what's possible and then how to talk about these possibilities with people and often their families or close others in their life who may not have considered employment or just somehow have learned the lesson that it's not for them. And so we think about, how do we think about work, right? When we talk about work for people with significant or co-occurring disabilities, we sometimes need to shift how we think about work. I often talk to families or even professionals who will say things like, well, I'd love for my daughter to work. I really would. But I know what I do for a living. I know what my partner does for a living. I know what my friends and my siblings and my neighbors do. I know what I see when I'm out and about in town. And I don't know what she could do, right? And so the screened out cycle continues even when people would really like to see otherwise. So we're going to talk for a minute about how we think about work. And I mean real work, right? Paid jobs in the community where anyone else would be employed. And so in thinking about finding jobs, there is what I think of as labor market employment, and then there's customized employment. Both are legitimate ways to get a job. Supported employment is a service offered that can help find jobs through both of these methods, and then you use what makes sense for the individual person. The names in the billing vary state by state, but the methods are viable for anyone. Labor market work is what this mom was thinking of, right? Having the qualifications and ability to do all of the components of a job description with or without reasonable accommodation. And lots of people can get jobs this way. We figure out what someone wants to do. You apply for an open position, get the job, and then they get support as needed as they go. Customized employment is when we look at what the job seeker has to offer, and then we find a business that has need of that and create or customize a position that fits the needs of both without regards to a pre-existing job description. It's a voluntary negotiation and it's a real job. This way of thinking doesn't look at what jobs can you apply for or where can you compete with others in the open labor market and get the job. It looks at what do you have to offer? Right? What do you have to contribute to a business? It very much is based on that discovery phase of learning these things. And then also what needs to be present in a workplace? What conditions are needed for you to be successful? And then it's not just looking for open positions that are posted, but learning about the needs of the business to find one that needs what this person has to offer and has the kind of culture that could be a good fit for success. It's a lot of research and negotiation, but it opens up the possibilities for employment and it brings a true benefit to that business. Because we need to start with the presumption of employability, that everyone has something to offer that is worthy of pay. And I find this a really powerful question. It's not whether a person can work, but where. Thinking in this way is the spirit of what Employment First is really about. And the second part of this webinar is really going to focus on those strategies to figuring out this question of where. Let's get back to those expectations for a minute that we talked about earlier. I don't actually know who all is here today, except I know there's a lot of you, but I'm sure we have professionals, family members, people with disabilities, various roles. And no matter your role, no matter your reason for being here today, in order for employment to work for people with significant impacts of disability, we have to raise our expectations around what's possible, right? It has to start with each of us who are interested in this. This is a quote from, it was actually a quote from a job seeker with a mental illness about the person who was providing those supports for her, right? About that paid professional, that employment support person. And what she said was, one of the biggest problems has been the low expectations of providers, right? Those of us that are paid to do this. Until I was connected with the keeper of hope, as she put it. He had hope for me when I didn't have it for myself. And this kind of relationship shouldn't happen by accident. It should happen by design. We who are helping figure out employment for people have to start with that expectation that things are going to work out. And then the expectation from job seekers themselves, right? This was a Facebook post from someone that I know who posted after she had first started working. Do you ever feel tired from working all day? I am, and I'm getting used to it. Life is life, LOL, and very typical social media speak. It's okay to be tired at the end of the day, right? Lots of us are tired at the end of the day or struggle on a difficult day at work or get excited about things that are going on. And knowing that that's okay for the folks that we're talking about is really important, that everybody has that chance to find the right job and figure out how to make that work. And then expectations of family members. Who very much want good things for their families and who may or may not understand the possibilities that are out there. And so this is what I found to be a really powerful quote from a mom that I heard speaking one time about this, who said that those programs where businesses hire people with autism are great, and I hope they have success and lots of people get jobs, but they aren't talking about my son. When they say autism is an invisible disability, that may be true for some, but they aren't talking about my son. For my son, it is very visible, but that doesn't mean that a job isn't an important goal for him too. All of his life, people have tried to tell his father and me that we shouldn't expect him to work, but we did. It wasn't easy, but he's now employed part-time in a customized job, and we live with the hope that someday, when we aren't here anymore, he will be gainfully and meaningfully employed and it's going to be okay. The reality is, we all know people with disabilities who are good employees. We know people with disabilities are successful in the workplace. We know that there are people who have been in day programs for years, assumed unemployable, who get jobs. We know people who have worked for pennies an hour in sheltered workshops that find jobs making over minimum wage. We know employment can play a strong role in the recovery process and keep people healthy, like many of you on this webinar have seen time and time again, right? So where will you fit into figuring out a good job for someone? So regardless of your role, you can be a part of this process. So Dr. Weyman is going to get into the details of this process in just a moment. We're getting to that. But as he does, I want you to think about where you fit in. What is it you know, right? Who do you know? Share what you know about someone, that job seeker. Add to the discovery process. What is she good at? What conditions are present when you see her at her best? What increases comprehension? What decreases anxiety? What needs to be in place for her to be successful? And who do you know? Right? Good job development is all about networking. This is where Employment First becomes a workforce development issue. We know people looking for work and we know what they have to offer and in what kind of situations they are at their best. This is what employers need to know when hiring and planning for their own workforce issues. That person you chat with at your kid's ball game just might be able to get the employment specialist in with a hiring manager at that local business they've been wanting into. Because the ultimate goal of the service end of employment is this, right? For that employment specialist or for the job seeker to be confident enough going in on their own to say, I'm here talking to you because I believe I can benefit your business in these ways. And so now it is my great privilege to introduce Dr. Paul Weyman, who's going to share in depth how we go about these processes.
Katie, I can't even believe that you hit 220 right on the noggin, right on the head. Backstory, Katie and I decided that we were going to share the responsibility for this important webinar, and she offered to do 20 minutes, and I'm like, oh my goodness, how is she going to do this right in exactly 20 minutes? And she actually did 15 minutes because of the introduction, so well done. Tough act to follow. I'm so glad that I had a chance to talk to people who are working with individuals with mental health challenges as well as developmental disabilities, or the other way around, because so often that is the case. That is what we are dealing with. The truth is, we really do know quite a large amount about the employment for persons with developmental disabilities, and even more with better controlled randomized clinical trials for persons with mental health challenges. I'm sure a goodly number of you today are familiar with the individual placement model, IPS, that our good friends Bob Drake and Deb Becker and Gary Bond started developing in the 90s. After support employment first came about in the early 80s. And at the same time, we've been working with people with developmental disabilities. So there are the actual model that we're going to talk about here about how to do interventions is very similar, yet the characteristics of the different individuals and frankly, the providers is quite different. And I think that may be one of the reasons that we're staring at that 16%. Let's face it, disappointing outcome. We're capable of more if we can put it all together better. So next slide. So where do we start to ensure movement towards achievement of real work for real pay? And again, just to pick up on that last slide, one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar today, one of the reasons that your participation is so important, and please tell 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 other people to take a look at these slides, listen to the recording, because many of you may well be gatekeepers as well as providers, okay? You may be the ones that are opening the doors. And the fact is that real work, has been demonstrated in multiple populations, including individuals with developmental disabilities and mental health challenges, to make them better, okay? It's clearly documented that there's greater independence, that in effect, we're not just talking about money and benefits and friends and self-esteem, but we're also talking about therapeutically getting better, less headaches, more, better sleeping, less behavior problems, less homelessness. And these are real factors that are directly related to work, okay? All right, next slide. So, to try and cover all of this in one 20, 30, 40 minute is, next to impossible. So I really want to just hit the highlights. And then I want to show a couple of videos of employment specialists who are actually on the job site working with people. But here's a model for you to use in the back of your head. If somebody comes through the door and they haven't ever worked, or maybe they worked and then they had a relapse and they've been out of work, internships, and also in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, so-called WIOA, there is a term called pre-employment services, pre-S, if you will. of which internships is a part. Personally, a lot of the research I've been part of the last 11 or 12 years has been with persons with autism who also have about 30 to 40% have a comorbidity of mental, mental challenges, bipolar disorder, depression, that type of thing. And we found that internships have been really a phenomenal way to reach out to people and to businesses, because a big part of all of this is not just the person with the disability, not just the provider, not just the case manager. Okay, that's the supply side. But let's remember the demand side. The business is critical in this function. Business is made up of hundreds and thousands of employees who have sons and daughters and wives and husbands and family members who have challenges similar to what we're talking about today. And they're also the place where jobs are. So you can either go directly to through the front door and you can try and get somebody a job cold, which we do all the time. And I'm not going to tell you not to do that. I'm not going to tell you that we haven't had success doing that. But another way to get there is through internships. It can be like the Marriott Bridges program, which is a 2 to 3 month one. They could be Strength on Success, which is like 4 to 5 months for individuals with emotional and behavior disorders. It can be Project Search, which many of you may have heard of. It's in over 300 school districts in the United States and around the world for 9 months for transition age kids. And that's where a lot of our work's been in recent years, following part of the model from the Cincinnati Children's Program. But so internships are important for a couple of reasons. One obvious one, the person gets to find out what they like and what they don't like. And equally important, the employer gets a real good look at the individual. I mean, there is a reason that internships are so common and popular with masters in business administration, nurses, school teachers. I mean, Lord, social workers have so many externships. I've worked with people in the School of Social Work, and I've been on some of the committees with, the deans, when they needed an outside person from either medicine or education. And the amount of external work that is done has just been extraordinary in the field, whether it's HIV or whether it's, correctional institutions or developmental disabilities. The field work is such a critical component because that's how people learn about each other and finally get to that competitive integrated employment. And some of the ways, certainly by no means not the only way, but some of the ways that these strategies kick into gear are working with colleagues that are in every state. There's a vocational rehabilitation program, and most of those programs are decentralized into field districts. So if you're fairly new to the field right now and you're trying to figure out how to help your client that has just come through the door, vocational rehabilitation clearly is a resource to get started with. And then along with voc rehab, there's over 5,000 community rehabilitation providers. Now, some would be in your community treatment programs if you're working with people with mental health challenges, but others might be in sheltered workshops, which increasingly are being called community rehab programs under different names. The segregation is increasingly being discouraged by the U.S. Department of Justice under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Mentorship, huge factor in the difference between success and unsuccessfulness, okay? Developing relationships with business. And then what I'm going to talk about probably the rest of the way is really kind of trying to get more into the clinical pieces here of supported employment and some of the different support techniques that occur through support employment. But these are just 3 or 4 areas, and there's others that I'm going to touch on just briefly because of time considerations. And I also think that sometimes it's always easier to pay attention and maybe learn a little something more that you didn't if you see a video of something's going on. And so in about 7 or 8 minutes, I'll start with one video. So bear with me. You only have to listen to me and watch words for another 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'm going to switch it over to an employment specialist that I work with, a couple of them actually, and you'll get to actually see some of the people, and they'll describe some of the interventions that were being used. So let's take a look at the next slide. So what is support employment, and what are these supports? Next slide. So our target goal, and not to be simplistic here, okay, but there's so many ways that people have abused, kind of where we're trying to get, is that it is competitive work in an integrated work setting, generally for those people with the more severe disabilities, who, because of the nation's severity of their disability, need ongoing support. In other words, if they don't have ongoing support, and I don't mean every minute, but I mean over time, intermittently, there should be communication between the vocational case manager, the job coach, which is a term we like to use, okay, or employment specialist. And I like to use the term real work for real pay, because lots of times there's a confusion that work for less than a minimum wage in a sheltered workshop is the same thing as competitive. Competitive work really means that if you're not working alongside people who don't have disabilities or a disability label, that it's not really competitive work. Okay, competitive work means also that your paycheck should come directly from the employer. Okay, now we like to see people work longer, but we know that some people may be 10 hours a week, others maybe 20 hours a week. Some may say, what the heck, I can do this 32 to 40 hours a week. So, at different levels of disability and confidence, all work is good. Okay, all right, next slide. So, I'm making it sound like support employment is, we've been here forever, it's no big deal. Actually, it was a huge paradigm shift from the early 80s all the way through to, and Katie was talking about employment first, which started in the early 20s, early 2000s up to 2020. And it was a paradigm shift because for so long, moms and dads and guardians were happy to just get whatever service they could get. So if they could get their kid in their son or daughter into a day program, which, by the way, usually costs $15,000, $18,000 a year, they were happy with it because it meant that their son or daughter was going somewhere, and they were hoping and under the impression that their son or daughter would get better and could leave there and maybe get a job. No, didn't happen. Okay. In fact, we know from the Department of Labor statistics that when the longer people stay in the segregated programs, the less likely they are to exit into real work for real pay or the competitive integrated employment. So my bias has been the sooner the better. Okay. Because what we want in supported employment is we want to put people out quickly, as fast as possible. We want to see that big smile on their face. We want to see them feeling good about themselves, changing their clothes into work clothes. Okay. We want the mom and dad to go to the soccer field and say that my son or daughter is working at, Best Buy, or he's working at DMV, or she's just started work at Starbucks for the first time. And, she's met so many new people now. Okay. Big paradigm shift, very big paradigm shift. But but hard, you say, well, then how come the percentage is low? Because it's harder to do. It's just flat out harder to do. It's much easier to pick up somebody, put them in a bus, take them, drop them off, come back at 3 o'clock and take them home again, or to the group home. All right. A lot harder to find jobs, get somebody who can do the training, get the money behind them, Medicaid waiver services, deal with the problems that happen on the job, find a good job coach. Is your head spinning yet? Mine continues to spin as I continue to do this work clinically. Go ahead. Next slide. So the voc rehab programs, which are around the country, work closely with the community rehab programs where employment specialists are employed using local and state money, Medicaid waiver money, rehab money, sometimes social service money. At times, it confuses me because it's not really that there's a shortage of money. It's more a shortage of we don't know exactly what to do, or we don't have the will to share our expertise with moms and dads and elevate their aspirations. We don't listen to what the clients want very well. That's why an internship can be so well. So the employer, in many ways, is a customer. They're taking a chance. We need to identify business needs. We need to think about creating relationships with businesses and maintain networks with businesses. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, who is this guy? What's he talking about? Well, it just turns out I happen to have an undergraduate degree in business, but then I went on and got a degree in psychology, and many of you may have degrees, you may have MSWs, you may have maybe psychology, but there's probably a limited number of you that have BBAs or MBAs or have worked extensively in business and then are career switchers. If you work in business, you realize, or if you are a part-time worker in business, and we love to hire job coaches who worked in business, then you see the people who are coming in to buy your product, okay? And therefore, increasingly, what we're finding is that they want to see people with disabilities working there. They like to go to a company where people with disabilities are. Next slide, please. So you build networks and partnerships. You concentrate on the business. The primary objective is to expand and maintain those networks. And so something Katie said, not that everything she said wasn't brilliant, okay, but one was particularly brilliant, was when she was talking about when you're looking to try and build a network or try and help a client that's just come in your door for a job that may have a tough history. Look around at their friends. Look around at your friends. Think about the connections that you would use for your own son or daughter. Who do you know in church? Who do you know in business? Who is in your neighborhood? And then when you're driving around the neighborhood and you see these for sale, for work signs, could my client possibly work there? Okay. Or could the referral of who I was thinking about work there possibly? Okay. All right. So let's take a look at one more word slide. And this is doing horrible justice to support employment because people talk 2 days on this, okay? But in a summary, you're going to meet two ladies. One name's Alyssa. The other lady's name is Whitney, and they're working each with different clients. And what they have done is they've completed a job seeker profile using discovery, some of the things that Katie was just leading into. They've developed a job based on that profile of what somebody really liked to do. They did job site training right on that job while the person was being employed. And then as they began to stabilize on that job, and we found, and we've done research on this out the yin yang, all right, that somewhere around 75 to 100, maybe 125, 150 hours or more, people begin to stabilize on that job, and you can spend less and less time with them. Now, those with the mental health challenges may be just doing just fine and dandy, and then all of a sudden, boom, explosion. Something happens in the work site that they like. Their medicine changes, and they blow, and then they lose their job, and we got to start over again. other individuals, and that's very similar, by the way, to a couple of people you're going to see from me in a minute. Other people will start slower and then get stronger as they go along and they stabilize, okay? But each of these are kind of the categories that you would take with somebody, because you always assume, Katie's comment about presumption of employability was spot on. That's in the law. And the thought is first, oh, well, we got to put him here in a segregated program. The thought is he can work in competitive employment. What can we do to make a difference? So let's go ahead now, next slide, and meet Damien. Okay, and this is about a 4.5, 5-minute slide. I'm going to let you listen to it. And then, kind of take it all in, because it's got an instructional feel to it. Okay, shoot.
Doing what you're doing.
I make a transformer.
On today.
5.
Ready, Damien?
Yes, I'm ready.
Damien had an internship in the inpatient pharmacy. He was responsible for checking all of the drugs. They're individually packed, and checking the expiration dates. And he also was responsible for cleaning the shelves and just really keeping it very organized in the department. This is something that they often needed a tech to do, but it really wasn't getting done as frequently as it probably should have been.
There is 6 runs to go, right?
This turned into a job because as the internship was coming to a close, the department really didn't see how they could continue without having him there to complete this job for them, because it really is critical. The job really evolved. In addition to checking the expiration dates, Damien also learned how to restock drugs, and then he learned how to make deliveries to the outpatient infusion center. This kind of came about because Damien was getting done with his work quickly, and he has a lot of energy, and that energy was being released in the department, which was causing a distraction to his coworkers. He has a tendency to script loudly, and he was actually getting on coworkers' computers and finding things to fill his own time with, which were not productive and were distracting to the department. His supervisors wanted to continue to have him working there, and so they contacted his job coach to see what we could do to continue to use his assets, but also to help out the department. And so that's how the delivery started. The outpatient infusion center is attached to the hospital, and this is where patients are going to receive chemotherapy and other cancer treatments.
Thank you for doing it.
When we're waiting in this room, how should we wait?
By the door.
And what's our volume?
Volume down. Volume down. I wait for Jessica in there.
Damien, it's okay to speak in a regular volume.
She's in the room.
Okay. We just can't shout things like "I'm finished." Does that make sense?
Nope. Not make sense.
When we're at work.
I keep the volume down. I keep the voice down.
How about your body?
Keep my body still.
Hello.
I knock by the door.
Okay, Damien.
It's
What
another
number is
run.
this one?
6.
Right.
This run is number 6. Non-chemo. No way,
Back,
Stephen. No way. Yes.
At the time, a volunteer was responsible for making the deliveries to the outpatient infusion center from the pharmacy, or if a volunteer wasn't there, one of the pharmacists or the techs had to do it. It really wasn't done on a strict schedule, and patients were having to wait several hours to get the treatment. The inpatient pharmacy and the outpatient infusion center decided to collaborate and create this job for Damien so that he was helping their department to run more efficiently to provide better care to the patients who were waiting for treatment.
I finish. Number 6 is finish. There's yours from you? I work in the pharmacy and OPIC. I open a suitcase, wait for chemo, and on chemo, I check expiration dates at work. I pull expired drugs and find month. I stay off this computers at work. I eat lunch. lunch. I follow the rules. I follow the plan.
Who wrote that?
I wrote it.
That's great. Damien's been working for almost 5 years, and we do continue to provide him with social supports at work. At this point, we are no longer implementing a self-monitoring plan and working on it together 4 times throughout the day. His department has been trained on how to enforce the rules, and Damien is at the point now where he has written his own plan, and he knows what the expectations are, and it's written clearly for him by himself.
Where we do next, Stephen? Where we do next?
Chemo and non-chemo.
They're both. Yes, they're both. What time is it?
Time to go.
10:30, please.
10:30.
The answer is 10:30. Run number 7.
We do continue to communicate regularly with the departments, and they know that they're able to contact us if there is a situation that becomes larger than what they feel that they're able to handle, or that they need additional support. Then they always call us, and we come and provide immediate support to the department and the employee.
So Damien is part of a large randomized clinical trial we did with graduating last year high school students. And some of the data on that is in the at the end of the PowerPoint reference list. And I actually just saw him. I was over at the hospital visiting my son, who I guess either my 8th or 9th grandchild, I think. I can't remember. There's so many that they've been popping out. And there comes Damien, going to do the infusion thing. This is, in the latter half of the COVID stuff. So, I mean, because he's deemed an essential worker, he's been at this hospital for a long time. We've really spent a lot of time focusing more and more on the under 30-year-old population. And of course, he was much younger when we worked with him, but to try and break that progression of disability benefits, which can happen the longer somebody is on SSI all the time. But so how do we learn about him? Initially, home visits, they interviewed his mom and dad, a lot of informational interviews and job shadowing, because he was in the internship program through Project Search. So it was really easy in many ways, because the hardest time was in his first, several months of the internship trying to navigate the hospital. But then after that, he got better and better and better and more capable. And the guy never misses work. Okay. So, when I put up the thing about the profile, these are some of the pieces here. These bullets are the pieces that give you, some of the ideas about individuals. And sometimes, if you're dealing with somebody who is minimally verbal or just doesn't want to talk, these are some of the ways that you can pull information out. Next slide, please. So, the job coaches, this is a list of the different things that a job coach will do. But they come by different names. Okay, there's a job coach, or they could be an employment specialist. Some folks call them employment consultants. Other places call them vocational case managers. I don't really care what they call them. Okay, the reality is these are people, real honest to goodness, trained people, often in the same degrees that we all have here on this list, and a few even with business backgrounds. Okay, but they all have to learn, some levels of technology, and even more specific than broad technology, assistive technology. They're going to have to learn about getting people to and from work. They're going to have to learn about talking with moms and dads. They're going to have to really be good at, frankly, coming up with ways of dealing with behavioral issues, behavior problems. So applied behavior analysis is a major aspect of what we ask people to do. not necessarily because people are behavior problems, but because it's a good way to systematically train skills. We're collecting data on site, and then that data gets fed back to the rehab counselor, who actually is often paying for it. Okay. So it all kind of works like, you send the person to rehab, they do an evaluation, they make them eligible, then they send them to a community rehab program where we hope that there's a good, well-trained job coach who then starts this process that we were talking about. Okay. All right. So next slide. So the next slide is about a young lady named Ellen. Lots of nice things about her. Dependable, focused, detail-oriented. She wanted to be a clerk, always wanted to be a clerk. Okay. And so one of her internships was more, clerical. Again, this was another one that came out of hospital, and she's making flu kits, and well, let's take a look at what Whitney has to say and some of the things that were going on with her.
Ellen was in Project Search in 2010, 2011, and she has been employed at St. Mary's Hospital since the summer of 2011. When Ellen was in Project Search, her internships were with Employee Wellness, the Foundation, and with the Diabetes Treatment Center. Each of the jobs that highlighted her skills were clerical types of tasks, and so we worked through the hospital to find offices where we were able to do paperwork and data entry.
To scan all the documents, it will be done for 2 months.
Ellen showed us that she really excelled in these areas. She does very well when she has a structured routine, when she's working independently, and when she's in a quiet space. Ellen has a tendency to talk to herself while she is working and throughout her day. She does a lot of scripting, and her voice can increase in volume, and so it's better for her and for others for her to be in a more quiet environment. The job that Ellen has now is with Employee Wellness, and she thrives in this job because it's so structured and it's so routine. She comes in each morning and her job is to do scanning. This might seem really mundane, but it's an important job for the hospital, and it provides her with so much comfort to work through her daily routine. There have been times where we've asked Ellen to do things that were not a part of her routine, and that unexpected change can be really challenging for her.
They're yelling loud, normal voice, normal in public. I mean public and private.
Okay.
So when we're at work, which voice do we use?
Blue.
So Ellen has an iPod with her every day at work, which she keeps some work supports on. She keeps this on her desk. One of the things, the background of her screen is what we call the incredible 5-point scale. And one of her challenges is keeping her voice volume appropriate for the workplace, and so this is a reminder for her of where her volume should be when she's at work.
What about gray?
No talking, that means quiet.
It also comes in to play when we're providing her with instruction, because as opposed to being like, shh, we have to be quiet, or, telling her you're being too loud, we can simply ask her a much more subtle question like, what color should we be at, or where are we, or to just even point, depending on what the situation is. Her employer is also aware of this and is able to give her the same cues.
Do I need to take this off or not?
Not yet. Not yet.
For how many minutes have left?
Maybe 5?
No, I don't want to take it off yet, do I?
Maybe 3 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is okay now.
It seems like so much of what goes on in the day is really just providing employers and coworkers with really simple instruction to educate them on the best ways to work with a specific person with autism.
So let's get through these last couple slides, and then I've got a few comments that I want to add about the application of the model here that Katie and I have been discussing to other populations or populations that you may deem closer to who you work with. Okay, but technology is very important, and I might add that. Well, I'm going to show you something of somebody who was at Walgreens. The reality is that really, if you look at Teladoc and Roman and a number of companies that are coming out now, everything is being done increasingly, even pre-pandemic, using remote connections. Okay, bug in the ear types of things. So instead of having Alyssa stand there as a job coach, you could be having somebody who was senior to her guiding her with some of the problems that this young man is having, for example. Or rather than having Alyssa sit there with Ellen, maybe Ellen could have a bug in her ear getting the information. And those are things that we're experimenting with right now. I know in Iowa, well, he's retired now, but a guy named Dave Wacker has been a real leader in doing that and helping deliver services for kids with emotional and behavior disorders to teachers, because it's such a spread out, a rural area. Okay, so let's take as we close out here, last couple slides or so. So technology is going so fast, clearly it is 800-pound gorilla if you can keep up with it. Go ahead. So, if you look at 2G, and that's going way back, here we are now in 5G, task reminder alarm. And a lot of this is still very appropriate. Memo for task description, and a key feature here, auditory cues and also task sequences, because a lot of folks will forget. Now, you might say, well, that's because that person's got an intellectual disability, but it could also be because somebody has a history of alcoholism, okay? And, that alcoholism has caused them to not think as clearly, and therefore, their brain is not using the executive function as well. And we found this over and over again with people that we work with traumatic brain injury and PTSD coming back from tours from overseas. Next slide, please. So, you have things like automated reminder alarms for people who decide that they want to oversleep or not catch the bus on time, photo sequences so that they have pictures that tell them what they're supposed to be doing. And I don't have to read these things to you. It makes sense. Go ahead. And, then we have, here's a picture of a guy who's minimally verbal, still in with his mother, 34 years old, but guided with alarm reminders and activity descriptions for each task day as a custodian. All right. And, popular thing now is to say all food and filth jobs are terrible. And of course, the ones that I just showed you in the hospital were not food and filth, but I come from the camp of all work is good, especially if it's the first job, okay, to build a career. All right, so as I close out here, again, with about a minute to go, it looks like, and that's kind of more the same, reducing anxiety from shifting from task to task and living perseveration on a particular task. I want to leave you with these thoughts because the very title of this webinar includes such a broad range of challenges that people are going through. It could be more mental health, or it could be more DD, or one could be, or it could be both, but one is influencing job procurement for them more so. And a lot of that has to do with brain function, but it also has to do with their desire to work and the family. I mean, we've spoken very little, really because of the limited amount of time on the family. We know that the key features for kids in high school, the number 2 predictors are having work while they've been in high school, so they have a work history and they're used to working. And the other is the family aspiration and support, okay? That can happen for people who have depression. that can happen for people who have Down syndrome and depression or anxiety. But the family support is critical across the spectrum, okay? And if you're talking about drugs or alcoholism, or at one point homelessness, all these features, and I've been in places like Vancouver where they have had quite a history of homeless issues, and many of the people there were heavy drug users, sleeping on the streets at night. And one of the things that they did to try and break through to some of that is to do exactly what we've been talking about today, and that is employment. Try and get them into real jobs and support the heck out of them, not just for their jobs, but getting them to work, helping them with childcare and some of those other aspects of things. So I see that by the clock it says 3:01. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your attention and participating. And hopefully you took something away from this, just even a little bit, and that you can share with somebody else. And it's really been my privilege and Katie's to work with you today, and we're more than willing to take any comments that you might have, as well as any questions. So I'll turn it back to Kristen.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. We are going to go into our optional 30-minute Q&A. So Paul and Katie will take your questions. You can put them in chat. You can put them in the Q&A. We can unmute you. We don't have any open questions right this second, Paul. Katie's been taking those as we go along. So Katie, if you want to address any of those, or we'll just wait for some questions to come up. And thank you all who are here that have time constraints or are choosing to leave. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Questions that were brought up tended to be with how to locate services. If pre-employment transition services aren't available for like before senior year, or where you would find services in your area. And a lot of times that starting point is your local vocational rehabilitation agency. The names change a bit from state to state if it's an office of vocational rehabilitation or department, but that's a good place to see what is available in your area. Sometimes there's entities in addition to just schools that provide those pre-employment transition services that Paul talked about, and your VR agency should be able to point you in those directions.
Thanks, Katie. There is a question in chat about an age when interest wanes on the job, or maybe a time period of being on the job, or what do you do when interest wanes on current jobs?
I'm happy to try and answer that. I need to understand a little bit more, Kristen. It was the question is, how long would you be on the job with support, or could you say that again, perhaps?
The question is there an age when interest wanes on the job? But
is there an age when interest wanes on the job?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a quick shot at that, Katie, and you can say the same. Actually, what we found, and our team has probably placed somewhere between 500 and 1,000, because besides our research, we also have a CARF accredited program with 20 job coaches. So VR refers to us all the time. And what we found is once we can break through and get people into a job that they like, that age really isn't a factor at all. Okay. The longer, I break it into 3 zones. The red zone is the first 3 months. If you can get somebody past employment, dropping out of employment, recidivism, if you will, over a 3 or 4 month period, then you're into the yellow zone, which means that they're liking the job and they're sticking with it. And if you can get into the 6 to 9 month, ideally 9 to 12 month period, people stay in these jobs a long, long time, almost to the point where it's unbelievable. Now, I have noticed on the group that's come to us that is exclusively with mental health issues, there may be more bouncing around with jobs because they may have a relapse and then have to start all over again, and it may mean a new job. But I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of age, as I would be that it might have been initially a bad match to begin with, or there might be outside circumstances that cause somebody to, either lose their job because of health reasons or moving away, and then they had to kind of start the process over again. But I do want to reinforce that any employment that lasts for any reasonable length of time is an extremely valuable tool or history to help for the next job. Because many of the people that we're talking about here today tend to be chronically unemployed the longer they go without any employment. They're either staying at home, collecting disability benefits, or they are in a day program, which is not necessarily getting them into a real job. And Katie, please feel free to add to that.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said. It's certainly not an age. I think that's the premise behind that idea of employment first, is that we look at employment first so you get into a job, rather than, as Paul talked about, kind of languishing in those other services. Or I'm sure we've all heard the term of kids who graduate to the couch, and don't go to work, and it's harder to get into the workforce then when there's been that lapse. And as he said, I think that job fit is so important. So one thing I would caution people of is, even if it's a really great job for someone, especially someone right out of high school, for a first job for someone, and it is really cool and it's a good fit, a really good job now isn't necessarily still a really good, interesting job 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Most Americans don't stay in the same job for their entire life. And so we want to make sure that that's true for the folks that we're talking about as well. If you just look at random social media, you see people always celebrating that someone's worked at McDonald's for 25 years. Well, that's great if they really love it, but most people don't work in entry-level jobs for 25 years. So always looking at what could come next and what has someone learned from this job experience. And if the interest is waning, maybe they're bored, right? Maybe there's more tasks that they want to take on, or different things they want to do, or different things to try, or get engaged in different ways at that business or in other businesses. And those are always important things to look for, and for yourself or on behalf of someone you care about, to advocate for in the system, to make sure people are paying attention and keep looking for something that could come next to build that career. I have a 19-year-old who's, not receiving VR services, and she gets pretty bored with jobs pretty quick. So it's about that interest and engagement for everybody.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, internships are helpful, but all too often they are limited to younger people, meaning those who are college age and a little older than college age. What about workers not normally considered for internships? What kind of options are there?
So that is true. That is true. However, well, let me cut to the chase on this. If they're, whatever the age of the person, if there's not easily an internship that is available, then you go directly to, either supported or, Kay was discussing customized employment, kind of a spin-off, a derivative, a little higher quality in some ways of support employment, in the fact that you're, often approaching an employer about a possibility for a job that hasn't even been advertised. Okay. And so if there's not an internship, generally speaking, what our research has found, and in fact, we actually did do a study on this that was published, where we compared people who were in an internship, they're all rehab clients, with those that weren't in an internship, and those that weren't in an internship also got jobs. It just took much longer. Okay, because see, the internship, especially if it was like 4 to 8 months, was almost like a pseudo job, whether it was paid or unpaid, because you were learning a lot about that person and they were learning about what they liked and didn't like. So if you're not going to do that, then rehab is going to have to pay for an individual to be job coached while they're employed at a job that we hope we've made the right match for, which is why that job profile is very important. Katie had talked about discovery. So although I urge the use of interning or even volunteering, okay, I really hesitate to talk about volunteer work because that then becomes almost the excuse for not getting somebody a job often. So, oh, well, he's a permanent volunteer. To me, a volunteer should be a person with disability that does volunteering should be side by side with somebody else who is either elderly or who just wants to volunteer some other time on the weekend. In other words, there's certain jobs that are volunteer jobs, okay? And they shouldn't just be for people with disabilities, but they are a nice way to learn. For example, if you like to work with animals, you could work at the SPCA, okay? That ultimately could turn into a job at Petco or something like that. So that's a good question. And again, I'd like to punt it over to Katie for her comments too, because I know many of the folks that are in employment first states, they certainly don't all have access to internships like Project Search or Bridges. They just have to go straight into the workforce, right? I mean,
I'm not sure I have a lot to offer. I mean, I know our state has an office that within the state that's not disability specific around internships and apprenticeships. So you might see just what's available in your state typically that may or may not be connected to a VR agency, or that maybe your VR counselor or a CRP, if you're working with, could get in touch with and learn more about those opportunities. Or like Paul said, it might just be something that gets set up to have a work experience locally when you figure out what someone's interested in. And I always kind of look to what's typically done. Like if at my age, if I needed to find a new career, I probably wouldn't be in an internship, but I would be talking and doing those informational interviews that he talked about to learn more about what the practical parts of a job are and what the reality is. So what are those ways that we figure out what it is we want to do next for anybody, and then try to apply that with the person that you're talking about as well.
Kristen and Katie and to the person who offered that excellent question. Internships are a luxury. Okay, it is nice to have an internship because the business gets to know the person and the person gets to know the different things in the job that they might like and not like. But for many, many years and in most places, you don't necessarily have an internship. You have to go directly to letting the person do what's called situational assessments, okay, or job shadowing, work tryouts. And then those are much shorter, but they at least give somebody a taste of what there is out there, okay? And then the employer will hopefully consider hiring them. And of course, having a vocational case manager or employment specialist with them and helping them do that job and making them more competent is a huge advantage over just dumping somebody in. I would never dump anybody in that did not have, a good likelihood of being able to be successful. That's the reason for the whole invention, if you will, of support employment and the customized employment ideas. I see somebody else has raised their hand, Kristen.
Yeah, we do have a couple more questions. At what age do you suggest to start mentioning jobs and prepare the mindset of individuals?
Really, as soon as possible.
I was going to say, I was going to start saying chores around the house is not a bad idea. 10, 11, 12, 13, summer jobs when you can get a work permit at 14 or 15. Build an ethic, a work ethic early on. And again, I'm back again. We now have research evidence that is supporting the fact that those who have paid employment across all disabilities, those that have paid employment versus those that do not are more likely to become competitively employed. And rehab would much rather see somebody who had a work history and a resume and could get a recommendation. So we want early workers. We don't want to deal with somebody who's been in a state institution for 30 or 40 years. Now, that's what happens with deinstitutionalization. And lots of times you have people in day programs and it's almost like day institutionalization. And it just takes way longer to be able to break through, and everybody gets frustrated because of the time it takes for somebody to get those jobs. great question.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that question of asking all of our kids when they're young, what do you want to be when you grow up? And thinking about those things and just starting those expectation seeds when kids are young. I see Sandy Whitecamp has asked this question in a couple of different places.
Sandy.
And unfortunately, I would typically say, oh, you need to call the benefits counselor. But since you are the benefits counselor, you've thwarted my answer. But it's a really big, it's a really big barrier to employment and an issue for a lot of people. And as you, the benefits counselor, knows, first you have to know what the realities are, because a lot of people can earn a lot more money than they realize and still keep that Medicaid or some of those benefits. Someone else in a string asked how much people can make before they, how do you balance tasks versus keeping your Medicaid? It depends what kind of Medicaid you have in your life, and that level of income is different state by state, often depending upon your Medicaid threshold. Sometimes you can get an individual threshold. So first you need to make sure you have a benefits counselor in your life, for someone who really truly knows what they're talking about. Sandy, I'd be curious to hear what you have found helpful, but a lot of times family needs to hear from other families. They hear so often the stories of the sky is falling and, oh my gosh, we lost everything, or we got this letter from Social Security that we're going to have to pay everything back, regardless of what the letter may or may not have really said, right? There's that fear, and those stories spread quickly. So I think when you can connect families or people who have gone to work and realize that the Social Security Medicaid sky didn't fall, or that had good benefits counseling to figure out how to plan for that, that can be really helpful, because, you know, Paul and I and the folks that we work with can be really good professionals, but families listen to other families. And so finding those kind of connections can be really good.
Totally agree.
And having Social Security's documents, right? Like pulling things from their website or fact sheets that maybe a state benefits information network system or something has, that are in plain language and easy to read, so that families can better understand the reality of what can happen and all the safety nets that are there.
Okay, here's one about the current pandemic. Do you foresee the pandemic as being a barrier for adults with disabilities new to the working world? They're finding some businesses hesitant on working with programs.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about that, of course. We did a thing in collaboration with Autism Speaks, because they were very interested in how COVID affected individuals with developmental disabilities. And we actually interviewed 5 people that had worked from anywhere from 1 to 2 years to 10 years. And we're writing up a paper that's kind of a qualitative analysis of their responses. And it was really interesting, because all the people wanted to work and they wanted to keep holding onto their jobs despite COVID, even when it was ravaging like crazy. And 4 out of 5 did all keep their jobs. They had their hours reduced because the business was doing significantly less business, but they had proven themselves to be so effective. And a couple of them were, you know, in the hospital, and they were deemed as essential workers anyway. Okay, now they weren't, you know, they weren't in the COVID unit, but you know, there was some elective work that was still being done at hospitals, like infusion for cancer patients, like you saw with Damien. Okay, so what I would say is that if the people that we've worked with in the model that we've described have been placed in an appropriate place that they like and are well liked by the employers and are doing well, they are less likely, they have shown themselves less likely to be fired and have been able to come back more quickly than others who were inconsistent with their work, and they got more hours. Now, of course, you know, you can't answer that question without looking at the whole economy right now. And the whole economy has been somewhat turned upside down with, you know, tremendous gross domestic product growth. And yet employers can't find people to do jobs. And that's because either the employment benefits are too much in the state, or people don't want to go back into the same jobs. They want different jobs. I mean, I think the economy as a whole is going through kind of a crazy transformation, which will probably happen through the rest of 2021. So the question is an excellent question, but it has to be viewed in the context, I think, of the entire economy.
And I have talked to a lot of employment specialists who said they've had better response from employers throughout COVID, who are really looking for employers. So a lot of that is, I think, how we explain what it is we do and why this person could be a benefit for that business, regardless. Which goes, I see there's a couple questions by the same person in the Q&A, talking about how do you build up a network of employers that are interested in hiring people through your program. I think it goes back to what Paul had talked about and what I had mentioned earlier of networking and being a part of your local business community. You can build up a pool of interested employers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have any job seekers who are interested or able to do that kind of work. And so in some ways, that's almost a reverse model of doing it. When we talk about good employment services, as with all of our service system, we use that term person-centered. But if you're going to be really person-centered, it means you start with what the person is looking for, and then you network within your business community to find an employer who's going to be potentially a good fit and learn more about them. So as long as we're always expanding that group of employers and where we're looking, I think that tends to be the more effective way to do that. Paul had mentioned informational interviews, and every time you go out and talk about a business and explain what it is you do, and I want to learn more about your business, because I certainly wouldn't want to just, place somebody here that isn't the kind of employee that you're looking for. The more you can learn about that business, even if you don't have someone who's interested right now, then you stay in touch with that employer so that down the road when you do, then you have that person and say, hey, this is what I learned about your business and what you said is really important to you. Here's someone that I think could be a good fit and an asset to your company. That's when that kind of pool and reserve of people that can be really handy. Someone mentioned the federal contractors. Of course, they are supposed to show that they are working toward that 7% utilization rate. So if you have federal contractors, that can be a good way to say, hey, here's a resource that I can be for you because I know you're supposed to hit this target. And I have people that are really interested in the kind of work that you do. So those can be good ways to do that. But in my state, you can't bill an employment specialist to go to the Chamber of Commerce meeting or to the Small Business Development Association, but oh my gosh, it's so helpful, because if you become a part of that business community and know people and know what those needs are, it just really increases the likelihood of helping people get jobs and making those good connections.
Yeah, the business network is all about building relationships and friendships, and not just trying to hit people up for jobs, but to talk to them about business. And I've always been a business wannabe. I mean, my hobby is kind of, reading, economic stuff and the Wall Street Journal and all that. And it's just amazing how that helps when you talk to employers, because what I always tell our staff is, don't talk about what you need, talk about what they need. Ask them how, business is going now that there's a reopening in the economy. Ask them where they're finding their workers. Ask them whether or not the new pizza place down the place is taking a bite out of their. In other words, show some intelligence and caring about what they're doing. And boy, that will open up the door to, hey, this person cares about me and understands what my issues are. And so some of that is done by going to the meet and greet meetings and friendships. But even if you're going in on a cold call, which I don't necessarily always recommend, you can certainly start with, look, I represent a vendor that is trying to help individuals with disabilities enter, the workforce. How is it going in your job? How are you doing with employers? I mean, how is business? And there's very few managers that don't like to either complain about how things are going or brag about their business. Okay, so that it took me about 3 to 10 years to completely understand how to flip it around from saying that I got a great worker to tell me about your job. And once you did that, then as long as you tell them that you're going to provide support for the individual and that you're going to be a connecting one, that you want to be a connecting part of essentially their HR team or their, their coworker team, it's a lot, things are a lot better. The data that we're presenting about our outcomes are not reflecting what we know. And I think a lot of it has to do with different state policies and quite honestly, it's not so much that people can't work. We know how to get them to work, but the benefits are an issue. Families are still struggling with it. And quite honestly, a lot of us just don't, a lot of new people in the field, a lot of our coworkers, they haven't bought into all of it. And remember what I mentioned, it's hard to do. It is harder to do this than it is to just drop somebody off, or drive them around all week, in a van to see the zoo or go to the YMCA. I mean, this is harder to do.
I think we have 2 questions left and we've got 4 minutes. Any thoughts on balancing competitiveness of job tasks and pay and maintaining the income levels to continue receiving needed Medicaid benefits?
I can do that in about 30 seconds. Okay. Hundreds, at least scores of people that we've placed. They work right up to the cliff, which is, I can almost guarantee you they're going to work. They could work 30 hours to 40 hours in some cases, but they all want to stop at 24 hours. And 24 hours is where they can get competitive employee wage. And after that, they get their 745 or whatever it is now. Maybe it's a little higher with inflation. It'll probably go over 800 from SSI. So you take that check and you take your business check, and unless you're really, and plus you're getting free medical assistance from the government. Okay, so why would you take a chance on giving that up? Well, it used to make me angry to the point where I would, make families irritated with me about it. And I finally gave up. Okay. I complained to Congress about it. I said, look, give people their whole benefits and let them work 40 hours. All right. Let them. And then if they can do it for 10 years, then you can gradually reduce it. And they just laughed at me. Okay. So, I don't want to make families mad. Okay. I want them on our side.
I think it goes back to the question though of just making sure what benefits someone has and what the different income levels are, because SSDI, SSI, Medicaid, they all look at those wages differently. And so I have found that sometimes people will use terms for one program when they actually have a different benefit. So understanding what that wage limit is, and then looking at those, and that's an individual balance of how much somebody wants to work or what kind of work they're interested in. But I think often the trick is really knowing what the rules are that apply. And your state should have access probably to a WIPA program, WIPA. So if you have a VR counselor, they might be able to help you with that, or find the WIPA provider in your area that can hook you up with a benefits counselor.
Okay, last question in 1 minute or less before we jump off here. Do you have recommendations for transition services getting set up with schools?
1 minute for that.
1 minute. Your best tip.
Remember I mentioned that term pre-S? I would talk to your teacher, your transition specialist, and or your local voc rehab person, and see whether or not your high school is engaging in the use of pre-employment services, because there are 5 components which are progressively more intense to lead to a job when you leave school. Okay, that's my 25 seconds. Katie, I'll let you have the other 30 seconds.
Those, I mean, service-wise, those are your starting points. If you're not getting anywhere there, looking for other parent groups in your state to find out what's happening. If you're being told there isn't anything in your school or in your district, if you can talk to parents through, if you're a part of a local Down syndrome agency or other parent resource group or advocacy group, and find out what's going on in other school districts, that might help trigger it for the folks in your school of how that can be set up to try and get something going. Because while it should be available everywhere, the reality is oftentimes it does depend where you are and what you have access to. So finding out what else is available can help.
And that's true. That's true for everything we've said today.
Yeah.
Families move to go to different areas because they know there's better quality staff or services. And it's just going to be that way probably for certainly the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. You'll get a follow-up email with a survey and some resources that Paul and Katie have shared. Thank you, Paul and Katie, for being here. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Kristen.